All right, today we're talking about population ecology. So if you had a population of organisms and you wanted to study the population, some of the things that we're going to discuss, some of the things that you can study about them, and some generalizations that you can make that will help you sort of categorize the type of organism and what you might expect from reproduction, mortality, etc. So one of the first things that you'd be likely to do is to want to know how many of a population are out there. So like just visualize if we were over in North Woods, which is across the street from the security office, and we wanted to study a population of squirrels. So the first thing we'd want to know is we'd want to know, like, you know, how many are there? So one of the things, there's all different kinds of ways of trying to determine that. You can trap them, you can set up like transects and listen for them, watch for them, you know, all various kinds of ways of determining density. So that's one of the things. Another thing would be their dispersion in the environment. In other words, like, how are they situated? Are they clustered? Are they kind of randomly placed, sort of evenly spaced away from each other? Are they just around certain trees or something? For example, maybe squirrels might be around oak trees that have a food source or something along those lines, or a nesting site. Other things that you can look at are like their like their reproductive rates, their how long they live, so their longevity, when they are expected to reproduce, when they're expected to die, etc. So one of the things that you can study is, or put in a table of an organism, is what we call a life table. And this might separate, like in this one, males and females, and it does like things like number lived at the start of the year, so then you would know like mortality, like if you did it for the next year. You'd have the proportion alive at the start of the year, number of deaths during the year, death rate, average additional life expectancy. Other things that you could also look at are things like the reproduction. So this table shows you a reproductive table for, in this case, the ground squirrel in Tioga Park. So anyway, this is, you know, the kinds of things that you could go ahead and put in a table, and that would give you some ideas about the organism. Okay, so the other thing that we can look at is something called growth curves. There's basically two types of organisms, although, you know, this is just kind of a generalization, but not, you know, not necessarily reality for every organism, or they would not behave necessarily the same way. But the first type of growth curve is what they call a J curve. This is what we call our selected species. It has to do with a curve that looks like this. Most populations will actually, so this is number over here, and this is time, basically. In this case, they did number of generations. But what they're saying in this curve is that most populations will start off slow and then rise up, and they will rise to a higher, you know, to their maximum level. Now, a lot of populations will reproduce very fast in a very short amount of time, and those are what we call the typical R-selected species. In other words, they have a huge reproductive rate because most of them are going to die off seasonally. That is, they will fall back down. I'll show you a graph in a few minutes that shows that. The second type of growth curve is this type. This is called the S curve, or what we call K-selected or logistic growth. So by the way, the K and the R are just representing numbers that they use to figure the curve look. So if you want to know that, they go through the whole math of that in the textbook, but we're not going to talk about that. All right, so anyway, logistic looks like this. That is, it starts off the same. In other words, it'll start off exponentially, but at some point, the environment will put a limit on the growth of the organism, in other words, the number that are making it, and they will level off and be supported more long-term over time. Really, this value right here, or that curve, will fluctuate around a certain point. This point that that it fluctuates around, that actual number in terms of the population, is what we call the carrying capacity. This is the number of individuals in a population that can be supported over time by that environment. Okay, so the things that can limit that would be things that we call limiting factors. So limiting factors can either be density dependent or density independent. So something that's maybe density dependent, let's say if we were considering a parasite load of the squirrels, all right? So if the squirrels rose to a high enough population and the parasites became so prevalent because they're passing it from one to the other, and that was limiting their population or making them decline, it would make them decline. And then when they decline to a small enough number, then they can go back up, and they would fluctuate around that carrying capacity for that density dependent disease, so to speak. Not really disease, but yeah, problem. There can be density independent things too, things like a nutrient that they have to have, or say, for example, this works more for plants than squirrels, but let's say they had to have a certain type of nutrient in their diet, and that was available in the environment, and basically it's if it was not available in certain places, then that was going to put a cap on their reproduction, and then their populations would decline. You can also have things like predator-prey relationships that are making this happen. Another point to make about this is limiting factors can change over time. In other words, it might be one thing at one point, and then let's say enter a predator, then it's going to be the predator that's the thing that is causing the carrying capacity, or a hunter or something along those lines. And in fact, like if you were considering populations of deer in Ocala National Forest, one of the management strategies for keeping populations of deer healthy is to keep them below the carrying capacity by letting hunting bring this value down under the carrying capacity, because the carrying capacity is determined by parasite load. So they actually take your deer when you hunt. They will take your deer, analyze it for parasites. If they're really high, they allow more hunting. If it's really low, they keep the hunting levels the same. And that's a management strategy for some types of organisms. All right, so that's K-selected. One thing to know is typically R-selected are small and reproduce very fast, but not all species are like that. Some things that are very large may actually have huge numbers rise over time in certain locations. However, something that is long-lived like an elephant, you would expect at some point the environment to put a cap on their population. That's general. Another thing is some things that are really small. In this case, they have paramecium in the lab, and also Daphne in the lab. These guys in the lab would follow that logistic growth curve. In nature, probably not. Probably they would rise, and things in nature would take them out. Things like temperature differences or chemical. Other species, this is a typical J kind of curve. It doesn't look that J, but it's kind of basically it, where it will go up and seasonally fall, and go up and seasonally fall. That's typical of that. Now, another thing to consider is something that we call mortality curves. Mortality is based on, of course, how many die per year. The perfect mortality would be everybody lived to the end of their lifespan and then died. Mostly that doesn't happen. Things that are longer lived, though, tend to have They have less offspring, but most of them make it, and only towards the middle and end of the life does the mortality rate go up. Other things that are really small will have huge numbers but die off super quickly, and then only a few live out to the end of their lifespan. And then some things are kind of in the middle. Now, this typically goes with the R selected typically goes with this line. So that would be the J curve and this go together, and the K selected goes with this. Now that kind of brings to mind something that we call life history strategies or life history traits. These are R selected are what we call pioneer species. These terms have to do with succession that we will talk about later, but basically an early ecosystem, the species that would come in are what we call pioneer, because they're coming in first, and they're usually small, they live short, they have a J curve, that is, they have huge numbers of offspring, but only once in their life, they don't have parental care, and they have, their lifespan is usually, really small. And so they may just be like a seasonal kind of organism. As opposed to later on in an ecosystem, as it develops, you're going to get more equilibrium species. That is, species that are longer lived, they reproduce more than once because they live longer in their environment. They may have parental care. So those are typical types of mortality curves that you would have. Okay, another thing that you can look at in terms of populations is that you can look at what we call age structure. Age structure, this is a human population age structure, but this has the basic types. That is what we call pyramidal. This is a population that is growing rapidly because the number of being born and entering into reproductive age is high, so it's going to increase over time. One that is like kind of more straight up and down, like these two. These guys are really slow growth, and this one especially is slow growth, where you have many people entering into the older age. And this one is kind of negative growth, but actually a lot of times it might be even an inverted pyramid. So this picture is not really showing you that as much, but consider, for example, like a Florida panther that is an endangered species where it would have negative growth. What's happening is most of the organisms are up here are getting older, not reproductive age, and therefore the numbers going in down here are low. All right, so that's what we would call age structure.